Good morning, or now good afternoon officially. I am Kerry Colanisi. I am the moderator of today's webinar on COVID-19 and comparative administrative law, assessing national responses to the pandemic. I am privileged to moderate a panel of experts from around the world who will talk about the developments and state of play in the legal responses to the COVID crisis in various parts of the world, from Europe to Asia to North and South America. The webinar today is sponsored by the ABA's Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice section. I'm privileged to co-chair that section with Bridget Dooling, and pleased to welcome all of you here today. The ABA section, of course, wants me to note, of course, that any views that are expressed here today are those of the individuals on the panel and do not necessarily reflect the views of the ABA or the Ad Law section. We will have a discussion at the outset, and then I will be opening up the session for your questions and answers to the panel members. To do that, you will scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you should have a menu that pops up, and one of the options is Q&A, and that's where you should type in your questions that you would like me to ask of the panel member. I will be monitoring that, and then we'll pose your questions to the panel when we get to that point in the session. I will, at this point in time, introduce our panel members and briefly, and then we will get started with our discussion. I'll go in alphabetical order. Dr. Bruno Cunha has about 15 years of experience in the areas of regulatory governance and administrative reforms and economic development in Brazil, and has advised the Brazilian government in these various areas for several years, but he ended that advice early in 2020, before the pandemic has hit. He has served as a research fellow at the Penn Program on Regulation that I direct at the University of Pennsylvania. Christy Ford is our second panel member. Christy is a professor and associate dean of research in the legal profession at the University of British Columbia School of Law. Her work focuses primarily on regulatory governance as it relates to international, US, and Canadian financial and securities regulation. Nason Mabubi is the research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, and serves as a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And he is a contributor to a fascinating blog and podcast series through the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. Professor Dr. Anne Mervisser is a professor at the Tilburg Law School in the Netherlands, where she focuses on public law, administrative law in particular, and regulatory governance in Europe. And we're very pleased to have her joining us from overseas today. And finally, Richard Parker is joining us here from the States. Richard is a professor of law and the director of the Semester in DC program and policy director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Connecticut Law School. And he focuses in his research and teaching on administrative law, environmental regulation, and trade issues. We are gathered today to talk about a crisis that for the last 6+ months now has ravaged the world, with millions afflicted of the COVID-19 disease, and hundreds of thousands of casualties during this period of time. Back in the spring, when the pandemic was first emerging, the editors of the Regulatory Review at the Penn Program on Regulation at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, decided to convene a series on comparative legal responses to the COVID crisis. That series was published throughout the spring and summer of this year, with a total of 40 different essays from contributors from more than 24 countries around the world, focusing on common themes, challenges, and issues confronted by the administrative systems in countries around the world. We're pleased that all of the panel members here today contributed valuable essays to that series, and we're delighted to have them here today to share their insights with you. At a time when, quite frankly, when we started the series, we never thought that one of the legal issues that we might be confronting here in the United States might involve the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This webinar, as all of you know, is being conducted today on the day when the news has hit that President Trump and the First Lady have been tested positive with COVID-19 disease. We could talk about in the question and answer period, perhaps what it means when a leader of a major country has been afflicted with COVID-19. We've seen this in the UK with Boris Johnson and in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. Well, with that, let me turn to the panel members and ask them if they could just to give us a brief lay of the land about how the part of the world that each of them has focused on is faring with the current pandemic. And the point here is not so much to share with you in depth everything that has transpired, but just to orient us in the conversation that will follow, focused on legal issues, just to orient us to how the nation is faring with the disease. So Nason, would you start? I guess, it makes sense to start with China because that's where this disease first appeared. And maybe you could talk a little bit about where things are at in terms of how China is faring and other countries in Asia.
Sure. Thank you very much, Carrie. And thank you to the ABA section on administrative law for hosting us today, including Chris Walker as the chair of the section and Ann Kiefer as the director. I also see many friends and mentors in the attendee list. So even though we don't have a very easy way to interact with you, I just want to say hi to everyone and thanks for joining us. I'll say just a couple of things first about China. I think we all know that there were some massive governance failures in the period of early to mid-December through probably about end of January, when the virus was first detected in Wuhan province, or in Hubei province and Wuhan city, that those issues reflect basic governance problems in China, and that resulted in the virus getting out of control at a stage when, with better governance, it could have been perhaps kept more under control. Since the national government of China in late January really began to take this seriously, to focus on it, to devote real resources to it in its own particular mechanism that's specific to Chinese governance, China has done, as far as we can tell, fairly well. What they've been able to deploy in controlling the virus from late January onwards has included the ability to lock down areas in very aggressive ways, the ability and the interest, frankly, to put massive amounts of resources into testing, the ability and the interest to use very sophisticated electronic surveillance through apps and the like, and also to use old school, very labor-intensive monitoring mechanisms that are rooted in, 1940s Chinese Communist Party history, the neighborhood committees and things like that. And using that wide range of tools at their disposal, as far as we can tell as outsiders, they have managed to take a situation which in January in Wuhan looked terrible, and turn it into actually what almost looks like a foreign policy triumph. For those of us like myself who specifically study China, there's some areas of concern. We do know that, for example, some of those tools that have been used to keep the virus under control in China are more aggressive and have more impositions on people's liberty than seems to be necessary based on how other countries have dealt with the virus, including other countries in the region. Countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam have all had better success than we have in the United States in controlling the virus, but have not gone as far as the Chinese government has gone in impinging on people's personal liberties. We do know that there are some areas, certainly prisons, and specifically in Xinjiang province, where that's a whole other issue of the Chinese government's actions towards the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. We do have some sense that the virus may be less under control in those areas, but because of the political sensitivities around that, we don't know too much about that. And of course, there's always a basic concern about how valid the statistics that are being reported out of China are, and the actions of the Wuhan local authorities in the December period or early January period don't give us confidence. And I'll close by simply saying that I think the consensus among the China watching community is that, yeah, probably the numbers that are being reported out of China are not 100% accurate. And there were more cases at the height of the pandemic, and there are more cases now than are being reported. But it's not so many magnitudes bigger than what's being reported as to reach a different conclusion that on the whole, using the tools at their disposal, the Chinese government has done a fairly good job of controlling the pandemic from February onwards till today.
Well, let's move around the globe, and perhaps this was the path of the virus to Europe. Certainly, from our vantage point here in the U.S., we saw the outbreak in China, and then we spent a lot of time focusing on and hearing about the outbreak in Italy, in particular, in Europe. But Anne, would you like to fill us in on how Europe is faring right now?
Sure, Gary, thank you. I vividly remember the day when President Trump decided to close American borders to travelers from Europe, and what a shock it was. And yet, we really didn't know that that was only the beginning, because at the moment, Europe is definitely facing a second wave, although I understand that there's some discussion among specialists whether a second wave is actually a thing, but it definitely feels like we're facing a second wave, especially in Spain, where I'm actually calling you from. I'm based in Spain, although I work in the Netherlands. And Spain at the moment is very much the epicenter of the revival of the virus. In terms of measures, I think we're seeing that the sort of cooperation-based governance that we had in the first wave is running out of steam a little bit in various countries. At the same time, I think that is pretty much all that European countries have in common. Other than that, we see a patchwork of measures, very different approaches. Discussion on whether the European Union should have more of a coordinated role, I think, is not so alive at the moment. And I think that is because we're also seeing a consensus that, yes, it matters how we behave, but it matters even more how we live. And precisely how we live is something that still varies enormously across member states of the European Union. And I think that is now widely considered to be a very strong argument as to why it might actually make sense to let member states decide on their own policies, and why closing bars and restaurants in the Netherlands is not the same thing as closing bars and restaurants in Spain.
Well, let's turn now to the south of the equator. And Bruno, would you help us understand how Brazil, or maybe other parts of South America or Latin America, are faring right now?
Sure. Thanks, Carrie, and Nathan for putting together this panel for us. It's really a remarkable opportunity for everyone here and the audience as well to not only get to know about experiences in different parts of the world, but also to draw lessons. And hopefully it's going to be the case, not only in the case of the administrative state in the West, but others as well. And I'd like also to thank the ABA again, like the previous speakers, for hosting such a special event today. My task is not very easy. My plan is to give an overview about Latin America. And unlike the previous speakers, I have more hopes on the opportunities perhaps for the future than in the case of the lessons learned so far. Even though there's some degree of variation among Latin America countries in regard to the responses to the pandemic, overall, every country or most of the parts of Latin America have had serious problems in rising up to the challenge. The situation is certainly much bleaker than in other parts of the world, and including parts of the developing world as well. Brazil, in my view, is a case in point, and not only because it's the largest country in the Latin America region in terms of population and economy as well, but also because it has similarities with the West, or at least with the current political regime and approaches that have been taken by the federal government in the West. And for that reason, I think it's a good point of comparison for this webinar. But to give the audience an idea about the scale and the consequences so far of the pandemic in Latin America, looking at the official records, you see that among the 10 most affected countries in the world by the total number of cases, 5 are Latin America countries, and they are in order: Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico. And if you then look at the rate of deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, 6 out of the 10 most affected countries are Latin America countries. So it's quite dramatic as a health crisis. And it's a huge problem that will be felt over many years for sure. In the economic front, we've seen already that the projections hover around 10% of decline in most of the countries or the major economies in the region. So it's also a very intense and alarming situation. Overall, the pandemic has certainly laid bare deep-seated problems, and especially the fragility of states and the quality of governments, but also some inequalities within governments and within state apparatuses became more visible, with capacity being very unevenly distributed between areas and within countries. It has also fast forward a few trends. One being certainly the risk of an authoritarian slide. Some countries have shown a clear decrease in the democratic sentiment among the population, and that has been measured by some groups and researchers. Presumably, something that we'll certainly talk more about later on in this webinar is the strengthening of the executive as well, vis-a-vis other branches, and the impact on the federalism as a system. There's another point that can be discussed here, and that gives just a broader view of the consequences, not only in the continent, but globally. The presence and the increased influence of China in the region, and to the point that some commentators have come up with the term mask diplomacy to connote the presence and the strength of China. And finally, also perhaps some opportunities that have been realized recently, especially very recently, on some programmatic and structural changes that have been pursued and should guide the recovery in the future. But it's certainly an area that has a lot to be discussed and compared as well. So stop here. So we hear about other parts as well. Thanks, Harry.
All right, thank you, Bruno. Let's move up north, I guess way north here for us, to Canada. Christy, if you could just give us a brief rundown on how things are faring up there.
Sure, can do. And thank you to Carrie and to Nathan for putting together this terrific conversation, which has been very rewarding and stimulating for me since we started it some months ago. I'm very happy to be here. So overall, Canada is really doing relatively well. Per capita, Canada has about 15 to 20% of the cases per million relative to the United States. And has managed to meaningfully flatten the curve starting at about May. And so far, those numbers have stayed down, although I think like many other places, we are concerned about the possibility of a second wave coming in the fall. If you look at the Worldometer stats, looking at deaths per capita, Canada is number 33 on the list. I think deaths per capita is probably the right statistic because Canada has not been testing in the comprehensive way that some other countries have been. But there's been a fair bit of unevenness around the country. Now, obviously, we could disaggregate any country into its various component parts. I think it's relevant to do that in Canada because we're managing the crisis in a relatively decentralized way. So some provinces have had tiny numbers. The territory of Nunavut in the far northeast has had none. The big four provinces in Canada really would be British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. They are the provinces with the strongest international connections and the largest cities and the like. And they have all really managed the crisis somewhat differently. So Quebec has struggled the most for a few different reasons. One was just a function of timing. Their spring break from school coincided with the early rise of cases. And that combined with the fact that Quebec has strong ties to France in particular, meant that there was an awful lot of international movement there. So the numbers spiked in Quebec early, and Quebec struggled to bring them back down again. Ontario has done somewhat better. Ontario is Canada's most populous province and has done somewhat better. Here in British Columbia, there was a concern that we would be at high risk for a couple of different reasons. There are strong connections here to Asia and to China in particular, strong connections south of the border to Seattle, which is very close, and which was an early, and which suffered an early outbreak. And in fact, we had a couple of early outbreaks in Vancouver in February, which caused a lot of concern. We have managed to keep the numbers low, I think really as a function of having a public health officer who's become a little bit of a local folk hero and who responded early and quickly with contact tracing in particular. So if you were to compare Canadian provinces to other countries around the world, Quebec's numbers look very much like France's numbers, which would be France's, I think, number 11 on the Worldometer list if you look at cases per capita. Ontario looks like Germany, doing better than France. British Columbia looks a lot like Australia or Finland. So what that means is that in this province, if British Columbia were a country, it would be having more success with this virus than anywhere in the Americas, almost anywhere in Europe, the Near East or the Middle East. British Columbia numbers are still worse than New Zealand, for example, Hong Kong, South Korea, far worse than Taiwan, which is having enormous success. But I think it's relevant that here in British Columbia, there has never been a lockdown. And in fact, across most of the country, there has not been a lockdown. Bars, nightclubs, and banquet halls have been forced to close early at various different points. But across the country, there's been quite a heavy reliance on voluntary compliance. And voluntary compliance has really been very high. In terms of why that might be, I think some of it is that perhaps the sort of historic distrust that we see of government in the United States is really far less a feature of interpersonal and state relations in Canada. I think we've been fortunate in that government actors haven't politicized the pandemic. So there's been cooperation among provinces giving, PPE back and forth. There's been cooperation between the provinces and the federal government where it's been involved. Politicians who've tried to make hay of the crisis or a failure of the response have not gotten a lot of traction. And the public facing faces of the response really have been medical experts across the country as opposed to politicians. And so we've been fortunate that way.
Well, that's encouraging. Now let's bring it back to the United States, and I'll ask Richard. I think, you know, for many of us, we're familiar, I guess, with, maybe more than we care to know about how things are faring here. But so certainly fill us in on that, but maybe you can offer some perspectives in particular in comparison with other parts of the world about how the US is faring and perhaps why.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Let me just echo the sentiments of others. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you and Nathan for putting this panel together, and to Anne and the section of administrative law for organizing it. What a difference a border makes. My goodness, how different things are in the United States and Canada. People on this call, I'm sure, are basically familiar with what's happening here. And what I will try to do is put our numbers in a comparative perspective. To date, over 7 million Americans have been infected. 207,000 have died, by far more than any other country on earth, with another 1,000 dying every day. Even if we adjust for population, we are still, according to the data, the 9th worst in the world, according to a comprehensive data set compiled by Johns Hopkins. Now, I don't actually believe we're the 9th worst in the world. There are data limitations overseas that will affect that. But I think what you will see if you actually look at the data is that there are many, many countries with reliable and modern reporting systems that report far fewer COVID-19 deaths to date per 100,000 of population than we do. For example, New Zealand, as an Anglophone country, has suffered a grand total of 24 deaths from the pandemic so far, which if you adjust for population is equivalent to about 850 US deaths. If you look at New Zealand on a per capita ratio, they've done about 106 times better than us in preventing cases, 243 times better in preventing deaths from COVID. You can spin the numbers another way and ask how many Americans would be alive today if we had managed to do as well as other countries in containing this virus. And what my computations reveal is that if we had done even half as well as New Zealand in preventing deaths from COVID-19, 205,000 Americans would still be alive today who have died of the virus. If we'd done half as well as Korea, 194,000 Americans would still be alive today. Half as well as Japan, 196,000 Americans would still be alive today. Half as well as Germany, and 128,000 Americans who are dead now would still be alive today. Moreover, in these countries, and this is even equally important, in most of these countries, the virus is largely contained. Yes, they're worried about a second wave, but what their version of a second wave is very different from our concept of a second wave. We have the virus actually rising in 21 states. Experts are really, really worried about what lies ahead when the cold weather comes. And it's not like we've actually saved the economy by sacrificing public health. Think about the numbers, $3 trillion of government borrowing and spending, $3 trillion over and above our usual deficit spending, added solely in the last 6 months, solely as a result of the pandemic. What has it accomplished? It's managed to reduce the jobless rate from the 22 million high in June to 11 million now. The astronaut, with 800,000 new claims for unemployment filed last week, bankruptcies accumulating, airlines are virtually on the verge of going out of business. People are very worried about foreclosures now and not being able to pay their rent with the stimulus bills running out. So the economic cost of our failed response has been just astronomical. And yet we still have this horrible public health crisis. So the question is, what went wrong? And what I tried to do with my comparative study was to look at how a successful country like New Zealand, which does not have a totalitarian tradition, which has a very, very Western tradition and Western set of values, managed to respond so successfully. And they did it through a very organized, very centralized approach. They did use a national lockdown model, but the message that their prime minister sent to their people was, if you do this strong, if you do it effectively, if we do a hard lockdown now, it will be short. She promised them a month when the virus hit. And that's what they did. They managed to basically eliminate the virus with a month of very, very strict police enforced lockdown, accompanied by effective contact tracing, accompanied by huge efforts to get testing kits from around the world and deploy them much more rapidly than we did, accompanied by a coordinated effort to get supplies from around the world. Very, very different from the United States approach. And we can talk in the second round of discussions about how the United States approach was different. But I think the best way to characterize the New Zealand approach was that it was quick, it was organized, it was centralized, and it focused on responding to a problem of science. The United States approach has been slow in getting testing mobilized, almost non-existent in terms of a federal role for tracing, punted responsibility to the states in terms of imposing social distancing measures. And what it meant for the states, to be responsible for getting their own equipment, for getting their own supplies, for getting their own tests, is that they were competing against each other and sometimes against the federal government for supplies. And in fact, the federal government actually sold large numbers of supplies, millions of masks to China in January and February, right before the COVID crisis hit us really hard. So we were desperately unprepared. And what our decentralized approach has meant is that states cannot offer their people, when they ask them to socially distance, they cannot offer their people the same compact that New Zealand was able to offer its people, which is, if you comply, if you lock down, if you socially distance, it will be short. This will be temporary. It will be over, because the virus lurks wherever the least effective state or the least effective municipality is operating. It lurks wherever it can, and then because we're unlike Canada, we travel. You know, I live in DC, and one day I travel from across three or four state boundaries, right, in the course of ordinary business. We travel across boundaries a lot, and jurisdictions matter. And when you have a decentralized approach, a state cannot offer the prospect to its citizens of, if you comply, this will be short, it will be over. And so we are left with basically a period of indefinite lockdowns. People are asked to sort of sacrifice with no end in sight. And if that's the bargain, no wonder they rebelled. And it becomes even harder, of course, to maintain order when you have your commander-in-chief and your president saying, this is not really a problem. Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota. We need to open the economy now, even before it's ready. So this is all familiar, but I think the fundamental takeaway that I would like to offer is that it really did not need to be this way. The pandemic is like the law of gravity. It's remorseless. It has causes and effects, and those consequences are what they are and cannot be spun away. But if you follow the playbook, as New Zealand did, as South Korea did, as Taiwan did, and as the best provinces in Canada did, you get great results. It's when you don't that you get tragically fatal results. And it's just as simple as that. It's just as simple as that. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. There's a playbook, you have to follow it. And we have not followed it so far. So that's our story.
And what about that you mentioned, Richard, you mentioned the ability for people to travel, you crossing, state lines just to go between Connecticut and Washington, D.C. What could we have done, or what could we still do, given the right of travel that people have to cross state lines?
Well, that's why I think, states have tried to limit travel. Connecticut has a quarantine requirement on people coming into the state. New York has these requirements. I don't think they are really enforceable. I've never seen any evidence that they really can be enforced, except on a voluntary, goodwill basis. That's why I believe that a centrally coordinated plan would have been much better for the United States. And I believe that there is authority, to do most of that in our Constitution. It would require Congress giving the president more authority than he's got now. It would require a level of trust between Congress and the president that doesn't exist now. But it could have been done, and in a normal, well-functioning American democracy, it could have been done. The president could have said, first, I have power under the Commerce Clause to impose restrictions on all businesses. I don't have power under the Constitution to take over the police power of states, and I can't commandeer states. But what I can do as a president is say that states who cooperate with our plan, and by plan I mean, the timing of social distancing, the measures that are in place for essential businesses to protect safety. States who cooperate with that will get large amounts of federal relief. States that don't cooperate with that and that undermine the plan will not get federal money. That would have induced cooperation. And the other thing that I think the federal government could have done, which would have been incredibly important and incredibly useful that they did not do, was take steps to increase production, really mobilize the defense, use the Defense Production Act, use the authorities that he already had to increase the production of masks and of protective gear. President Trump did not invoke the DPA for protective gear until, except for ventilators for patients on death's door, protective gear, not until late May of 2020. And after that, it took months for companies to scale up to actually manufacture that equipment, and they still haven't caught up. The American Medical Association says that they cannot accept mandatory standards for healthcare workers in healthcare facilities now because they just don't have access to the masks still that they would be required to keep people safe. So it's a huge failing, and it appears to have been driven by this thought that, well, the market should take care of this. We don't need a federal government to play a role in escalating mass production because the market will take care of it. And what that perception seems to overlook is that most manufacturers, including 3M, say, this pandemic is going to be relatively short-lived if we're successful. And that's certainly what they thought at the time. It doesn't pay us to gear up to retool our factories. We won't be able to recoup our investment. So the market did not just magically adjust to fill the demand, right? It didn't work that smoothly. And it needed the incentives and the mobilization of the government to do that, and they should have been compensated for that. They should have had their costs of retooling paid for by the government. What an economy that would be if we had enough masks. It would cover the cost of retooling 3M, 1,000 times over to have enough masks now that barbers could wear N95 masks, doctors could wear N95 masks, grocery store workers could wear N95 masks that protect them. And they give them confidence that they can do their job safely. We don't have that. So that's the huge failing. And I believe even in Canada, which has followed a decentralized approach, I believe, Christy, you said that the federal government has been instrumental in making sure that there's federal assistance in procurement of essential protective gear. Is that right?
Christy, you want to follow on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's quite right. So it has been a very decentralized approach in Canada around things like health and employment and the like. And so provinces are responsible for healthcare, for education, for whether our schools are open or not. And we are doing testing and contact tracing and isolating for those who test positive, social distancing with associated fines for not distancing. All of that is provincial. At the federal level, just under our division of powers, what we are seeing is that it's the federal level that closed borders, including the Canada-US border, which is closed to non-essential travel and has been since, I think, April. They've been stockpiling PPE. So we have a federal Minister of Public Procurement, who in fact is a former professor in a law school at the University of Toronto. And so there, we have a federal stockpile in the event that provinces need support with equipment. And then there's been financial support as well. So this is responsive to a question that I saw in the Q&A with respect to how people have been supported through this. So the federal government has supported individuals directly through expanded employment insurance mechanisms. And then at the provincial level, we've seen support for businesses to not lay people off, support for things like rental support for small businesses for their commercial space, support directly for college and university students, and then also mental health supports at both federal and provincial level, but really quite substantially at the provincial level. And now let me just say, like, I am not generally a fan of Canada's decentralized federal approach. The fact that we are so decentralized, and in fact that Canadian provinces have far more powers than American states, raises no lack of problems. We don't have a national securities regulator. Just last week, the Supreme Court of Canada was hearing a constitutional question around whether or not the federal government had the power to create a new environmental protection law in response to climate change. It's not even clear that the federal government can have a comprehensive environmental set of standards. And so our decentralized system, you know, under which the federal government can only act if it is demonstrable that the provinces acting together cannot solve a problem. That's the standard. It has caused all kinds of challenges. But what I would note is that when it comes to COVID, we don't seem to have suffered enormously as a result of that decentralization. There are different numbers of different infection rates in different parts of the country as a result of factors which are not related to federalism. And so I would say, I guess, that, you know, I wouldn't want the discussion to be so really overdefined in that way. I don't think federalism is, or the structure of federalism is as important as, for example, high degrees of compliance or putting the medical professionals in charge of making decisions.
One thing it may be that there's not much difference in what one really needs to do or the tools that are available here. What, you know, no matter what the jurisdiction is, although there is this issue about travel and transportation, and you said that in Canada you don't have a lockdown. So I don't know if there's just much less travel across provinces in Canada.
Provinces are a lot bigger in most of
they're much
Canada,
bigger.
except for the east.
There's fewer of them.
I mean, yeah, provinces are far, far bigger than any of the American states, even Texas. There's an awful lot of travel between certain borders. I mean, the Ontario-Quebec border is highly populated, and there's lots and lots of movement back and forth. What the provincial government of Quebec has done extraordinarily has been to lock down certain areas of Quebec where there have been outbreaks, so particular municipalities. So they're not operating on a provincial level, they're operating on a more granular level that way.
Nason, I saw that you wanted to jump in, and I noted also in the discussion about provision of masks, for example, that Korea worked with private industry to make sure they had enough masks for every single household for pennies, basically. And here in the States, we could pay, $25 and not even be able to buy a mask. So what about the centralization, federalism kinds of issue, and how is it playing out in Asia?
Yeah, I do want to speak to that, and then also add a related point that goes to this question of masks. That's somewhat different, but on the federalism, centralization points that have been discussed so far, and I, certainly with respect to the U.S., I agree completely with Richard's analysis. China is not formally a federalist political structure. There are provinces, and there's forests have been destroyed for the books written about the decentralization in Chinese governance and the relationship between the center and the local. In the particular instance of this pandemic, the failures of the local, provincial, and municipal authorities really reflect the dilemmas of the relationship between central and local power in China. Why did the Hubei provincial and Wuhan municipal authorities work so hard to hide what they knew from mid-December was a problem from national level authorities? It goes to this very complicated set of incentives that Chinese governance sets up, which is basically that it's better to manage a problem if you can keep it under wraps than to report it up. And of course, that ended up blowing up in their faces. And once the national government did get a clear sense of what was going on and did now put in all the resources that they put in since the end of January, the provincial or municipal decision-making authority is not as relevant in China's pandemic response. And it's almost funny because there are moments here and there where there have been flare-ups in various parts of China, including in Beijing. And the response of the Chinese government is to very aggressively demote even, low-level bureaucratic officials who have some degree of responsibility in that area as a way of signaling, sort of almost virtue signaling that it's their fault that this happened. So that dynamic, in terms of the pandemic response after January really just shows the strength of China's central government when its attention is brought to bear on something. And of course, its attention can't be brought to bear on all things all the time. And it's in those other cases where the reality of decentralized power in China becomes more clear. The slightly orthogonal point that I just wanted to add to this, because the way that Carrie first posed the question to Richard was sort of what could we have done better here? And I think Richard's answer, if I understood it correctly, really was focused on what the central, the national government here could have done better in coordination with local authorities or state authorities. The additional point that I want to add to the conversation that relates to the experience in Asia is that there are social practices in Asia that have been very effective in combating the virus that we have not been as good at here, and in particular, mask wearing and comfort level with testing. And in terms of understanding why that is, and that's true in China, it's true in South Korea, it's true in Vietnam, it's true in Japan, it's true in Taiwan. Part of that obviously connects to communications from the national authorities. And so that does kind of loop back into Richard's point. But part of it is cultural, and not cultural in some kind of essentialist sense. It's not that Asian people happen to like wearing masks more. It's culture as constructed because they had the experience of SARS in 2003 and MERS in 2015 that was maybe felt more sharply in Asia. And so people learned to wear masks. And so one of the dynamics that I think was particularly interesting to those of us who study Asian jurisdictions was in the early stages of the pandemic in the US when people were not interested in wearing masks. And even to this day, I think there's a good number of American citizens who do not want to wear masks. In some places, in Philadelphia, for example, I think we've overcome that, but there are other places in the country where that's still a problem. Asian people would look at them and be like, I can't believe they're having so much trouble, just as individuals making individual choices to get comfortable with doing what we have learned through the experience of the last 15 years is essential for combating that. So again, maybe that all loops back to Richard's points about the structure of government. Maybe it's a slightly another thing that has to do with communication strategy from government, but part of it is also cultural practices that maybe can only be forged once people go through an experience like this.
That raises a broader question that I think emerges almost any time when we engage in comparative legal analysis. How much is of what we observe in people's behavior due to differences in laws and legal structures, and how much due to other factors? And how about in Europe on this federalism versus centralization issue in particular? How has that played out in Europe?
Yeah, I think there are several interesting cases in this respect. Also because I think in Europe, countries that are federations in name are not necessarily more decentralized than those that perhaps aren't, formally speaking, federations, but have a type of quasi-federalism, like Spain, for instance, UK. But in any case, I think now that the sort of novelty of the crisis is wearing off, and that we're in a situation that Richard also pointed out, where authorities are not able to say to their citizens, "Trust me, it's going to be hard. It's going to be brief. We'll get through this," right? So, and countries that had a very strict lockdown, like Spain, like Italy, also know that they cannot do that again. So they're having to reinvent a little bit how they do this. And I think at the moment that is resulting in a lot of blame shifting across different levels of governance. And I think that is something that we see all across Europe. And also in decentralized countries like the Netherlands, for instance, where I'm from, it's a small country, a unitary state, but it so happens to be that when it comes to public order, special so-called security regions have a lot of competences, because we like to do these things through mayors, right? Very fashionable. Let mayors run the country, right? But it so happens to be that Dutch mayors, they don't want to really be in charge anymore of handling this crisis. And they're saying the Netherlands is too small for a regional approach. We want national measures, right? Take Spain. Madrid at the moment is the very epicenter of the crisis in Europe, or perhaps even the world at the moment. It's really quite bad. And it's entering lockdown as we speak. But the story of how that came about and why it came about only so late, I think is also very telling of what's happening with the way the Spanish quasi-federalism is functioning at the moment. First, there was a negotiation between the Social Democrat-led national government and the conservative-led regional government. That in itself, the fact that there was a bilateral negotiation between the region and the central government did not go down well with some of the other regions. Right? That's against the rules of the game. Well, then sort of almost parallel, a body called the Interterritorial Council managed to reach an agreement saying, well, why don't we just set indicators? And when a certain region crosses those indicators, that there's more than so many cases per 100,000, and then combined with some other indicators, automatically certain measures will set in. But that way we sort of don't have to have this political squabble all the time. That's been agreed on, although not all regions have voted for. And Madrid is currently fighting that, as I understand, in the National High Court, and we don't know the outcome of that case yet. So just as an example of why, yeah, I mean, certain types of federalism seem to work against handling this crisis well, but at the same time, I don't think there's an example in Europe of where the way federalism or a strong centralization of the state structure has been organized is currently working very much for that country in handling the crisis.
Your point also about the ability to blame someone else when there is a division of authority, either at a federal or perhaps even at the horizontal level, is striking. It reminds me of Madison's aphorism about having ambition counteract ambition. Maybe that should be rewritten to say that federal structures or separated powers provide an opportunity for blame to counteract responsibility or something like that. Bruno, how about in Latin America? How does this federalism, centralization structural question playing out?
Well, I think that in the beginning, it seemed that federalism could perhaps play a bigger role. We saw that countries like Chile and even smaller countries like Costa Rica that are not federalist countries, they in the beginning they performed quite well, or reasonably well. They were able to contain the crisis, and the centralization combined to the a more clear leadership from the president, from the center, was more able to make these countries a bit safer, I would say. But even in the case of a large federal country as Argentina, the ability of the central government to impose a lockdown, a quarantine across the country, that worked in the beginning as well. But over time, and I was just reading again some of the essays for the series, the regulatory review series, and even in my essay about Brazil, I point out that Argentina, in this era of federalism, as opposed to more centralized system, was proving pretty much like Germany, Australia, and Canada, that the federal system was not per se an element that would determine one outcome or another. But now we see that whether or not a country is a federal regime in Latin America, I cannot really draw a distinction between what they've been presenting or how they've been performing as compared to non-federal countries. If you look at Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, these are formal federal countries. They haven't been performing well, but at the same time, the situation changed quite a bit in Chile and Colombia and even Costa Rica, where I'm based right now. I'm not in Brazil. I've been living the last months in Costa Rica. It seemed a quite safe country, and the leadership was clear and things were going well. China was quite present in providing assistance. But over time, the idea of a fatigue on the population, even though it's quite a contested terminology, even for the behavioral scientists, I've just followed. I was actually in one webinar the other day where someone that was more into this area than myself was sort of making the argument that the idea of fatigue, and he was actually reflecting about Europe, was not a real scientific concept, and even the experience of the UK was not enough for proving that would happen in our population. But in my view, in Latin America, that can be identified because of pre-existing conditions, namely just a few of them. Informality. In Mexico, over 50% of the economy is informal. The labor market is predominantly informal. So people are street vendors, they are Uber drivers, they have to go out on the street. And that combined with a lack of leadership or misguided information or misjudged policy, create a sort of this latter factors perhaps draw a nice comparison with the US, because the confusion between, even though obviously the US has a much sort of better structure for protecting the population, the confusion between signals sent by authorities plus an informal economy, or informal that is an economy, a labor market that's not properly guarded by the labor law. Let's say that's the labor law would be the frame. Would work as a stimulus for people to go out on the streets and to not comply with the laws. But in essence, federalism is still a component that's not completely understood in light of the pandemic, and the results are quite diffuse and conflicting compared to federal countries and not in Latin America.
I think your point also reminds us we should all probably have some intellectual humility as to what kind of inferences we can draw at this point about any legal structures and how they bear in terms of efficacy in dealing with the pandemic. This is still a live, dynamic situation, certainly. I'd like to shift back to the US, and Richard, first invite you if you have some responses here on the federalism centralization point that you'd like to make, but also like to sort of shift gears and go around the panel one more time with another issue, and that is about judicial oversight. And what role have the courts really played in each of your countries, parts of the world that you've been talking about here? What role have they played, not played, in the national responses that you've been studying? So, Richard, again, feel free to respond to this round of centralization, but then please pivot into the discussion of judicial oversight. And I'll encourage anybody on the call. I know we have a few questions already in the Q&A, but please feel free to add some more. Go ahead, Richard.
Sure. Just to respond to Christie's point and also to clarify one thing, I hope I'm not understood as saying that if only we had just left this pandemic response to the Trump administration to administer things centrally, everything would have been fine. A centralized response requires a well-functioning federal government. That's the downside of it. A lot hinges on the adequacy and the effectiveness of the federal government if you're going to give it that much power. And the problem with the Trump administration was that they had already disbanded a lot of the structures that had been put in place in previous administrations to deal with this pandemic response effectively. And the one time that the federal government really asserted itself in this whole pandemic response trajectory was with the FDA in rejecting early on in the process proposals for emergency use authorization for test kits developed by academic centers and private industry. They sat on those applications for a month while the pandemic spread. It was widely recognized as a fiasco, a classic example of sort of agency tunnel vision. They just wanted to get their test. We can make this work. We can make this work. And that's where you needed a White House that could break eggs, basically, and make things happen and get them off the dime. And it finally happened in the end of February, but it cost us five critical weeks. And I think after that, the response of the White House was, we're just going to sit back and we're going to leave this to the states. And in fairness in response to Christy's point, I've been thinking about it. And I honestly don't think that the state response would have been as problematic had there been more homogeneity among the states as there was in the federal provinces in Canada in terms of their attitudes. The problem with the state response, the decentralized approach in the United States, is that it was never really given a fair shot, because you had the Trump administration, well, Trump himself actually, not the administration, just Trump himself, tweeting that this pandemic is being overblown, tweeting that it's harmless, tweeting that there's this remedy and that remedy, tweeting that you don't need to take it seriously, saying that reopening the economy is more important. And what that did is it created this massive divide between red states and blue states that scholars have documented. And it created these divisions of policy, not only within states, but between states, which exacerbated the problems of having not only a coordinated response, but a federal response, but just, a synchronized state responses. Blue states responded very differently than red states in different timing with different levels of severity. So I don't think the decentralized approach was ever really given a fair shot in the United States, is what I'll say. But with 50 states and as much travel happening, I think it would have been very, very difficult.
And you also, you pointed to the divisions within the states, and maybe this is a way we can pivot to the role of the courts.
Yes.
Because you saw actually the governor of Georgia at one point in time taking the mayor of Atlanta to court. So even within red states, you had red state governors and blue city mayors in conflict, and the courts then at times being brought in to settle these issues, or at least being threatened as a hammer and exacerbating some of these divisions. But more generally, Richard, what can we draw from the U.S. experience about the way the courts have been involved in this?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I had my research assistant look into some of the cases recently when you asked me to address this on the panel. It's not something that I've studied in great depth, but my impression is that there have been quite a few cases brought against a state governor. There has been no federal lockdown response, so there hasn't been a chance for a test of what is the scope of powers for federal authority, because the federal government hasn't asserted any authority. At the state level, state governors have tried to lock down their economies, and there have been a number of lawsuits brought against governors in those states, usually by Republicans Republican Republican dissidents in Democratic-led states. And that's simply because Democrats don't, challenge the authority, and Republicans do, but they're not going to challenge another Republican, so it ends up being this partisan divide. Most of those cases were brought in the spring. They didn't go very far. They failed most of the time. There was one notable case in Wisconsin which made national headlines, where a judge found that the Wisconsin governor had acted outside of his authority from the legislator in doing what he did with the pandemic. But that wasn't a constitutional challenge. That was a challenge to his authority under state law. So it was a very limited holding. The Supreme Court of the United States has gotten 4 petitions so far to stay state court or federal state court orders on constitutional grounds, usually asserting that they violate the First Amendment right of freedom of religion because churches are being held to the same standards as other large gatherings. The courts the Supreme Court has refused to issue any stays in any of those 4 cases. But there has been one case very recently in September by a federal district court in Western Pennsylvania, where a federal judge, a Trump-appointed judge, did hold that the Pennsylvania measures enacted by the governor were an overreach of his authority, an abuse of authority, that they were not well tailored to the need. These measures that were challenged in that case are no longer in effect. So some people were arguing that this case should have been dismissed on mootness grounds, but the judge found, not completely implausibly, that because these measures could be reimposed at any time, including in the fall, that the case should still be held, should still move forward. So he decided against those measures. It is widely expected by legal scholars that I have read, although this is very preliminary at this point, that the Third Circuit will overturn that decision on appeal, but that decision is on the books. He has not issued a nationwide injunction or anything like that, but it is the opinion of one federal district court judge. But as far as I know, that's the only legal challenge that has succeeded to state court, to gubernatorial exertions of authority to try to regulate the economy in their states.
And in Europe, has the judiciary been playing a role in the responses that and challenges to responses by countries in the continent?
Yeah, well, on this topic too, a lot of variation, but I think I can generalize a little bit and say that I think most successful challenges have been more, say, the low-hanging fruits. So fines that people incurred because they violated a coronavirus measure. There's been a case by the German Constitutional Court that always has wide authority that goes beyond the German borders normally, where they denied a preliminary injunction, where a citizen argued that a state regulation prohibiting, among other things, religious gatherings in churches was infringing upon his constitutional rights to exercise religion. But there the courts weighed that against the duty to protect life, which I don't think is a duty that is enshrined in most constitutions, but still I think the basic principle is not completely alien to other jurisdictions, and where the court said unequivocally that the duty to protect life had to prevail here. So that was denied. And I don't think there have been any sort of big successes of that scale. There are, I think, still lots of challenges in preparation, particularly in the UK, where, of course, judicial review stretches a bit further, and it is easier to use judicial review also to try and do something against what you might perceive as an omission by the authorities. That in most countries in Europe is harder. You'd have to go to civil courts. You'd have to think in terms of liability law, where obviously the standards are a little bit harder to pass.
Thank you very much. Bruno, in Latin America, what can we say or learn about the judiciary and its role there?
In Latin America in general, the executive has clearly dominated the scene. We've seen, before going to the judiciary, the parliaments in different countries playing a sort of important role, even though there has been an interesting study by a foundation based in DC that covers Latin America and the role of parliaments, proving that parliaments in general have been sort of working beyond the expected level of competence. Let's put it this way, because some important rules and plans for recovery and for assistance for including poor communities have been presented to parliaments or had to pass through parliaments, and they just had to have taken a lot of time to be either approved or rejected in some countries. But at the same time, there are interesting cases that parliaments that work quite well and actively on a digital basis, and that includes Brazil. And there is an interesting example that I've just seen that pops up here and there. That's Paraguay. For some reason, they were able to digitalize the proceedings in the parliament and so on. But going to the judiciary, there's a lot of talk on how slow the judiciary has been on providing assistance to very simple and hang-fruit cases. I mean, some of them have not digitalized the services. There are questions related, for instance, in Colombia, apparently this has been one of the more recent major problems, which is the application of apps, the use of apps to control, similar to Asia to some extent, the compliance with quarantine rules. And obviously it brought up the privacy and other questions that eventually ended up in court. And so there are discussions going on there. And finally, there is this interplay between the role of normally Supreme Courts and authoritarian regimes. It has been appearing here and there, from El Salvador to Brazil. And in Brazil, the Supreme Court was very important in setting some limits to Bolsonaro's attempt to impose his ideas and to not shut down the economy. That was mostly his approach. And also federalism playing a role here. But in most of the cases where states and mayors were brought, that decision was brought to Supreme Court against the decision of the federal government. In most of the cases, the states and mayors won the cases, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the competence of the states and mayors to decide on the extent and the types of services and essential services that should continue or not. It is not to say that the federal government did not get anything. There was some cases where Bolsonaro was able to again impose his ideas and carry on with his approach of allegedly favoring the economy as opposed to health issues. But I would say that the Supreme Court has been very, very effective, at least in Brazil. So far, they pose a clear limitation to otherwise more stringent or even reckless options by the central government.
Let's turn, Christy, if we can, to you and Canada. What have the role of the courts been there? What have been some of the issues facing the judiciary?
Our courts are not coping, I think, is probably the short answer. I am continually stunned by the failure of resilience of our courts of appeal and our superior trial courts in this pandemic. And just to be clear, thinking about it in ad law terms, judicial review is very important in Canada. It shows up differently. So we don't have the doctrine around rulemaking that the United States has, and we channel sort of all of that angst about democracy and delegation and expertise and the rule of law into our doctrine around judicial review of executive action. And so it is a very, the courts play a very important role around judicial review of executive action in particular, but the courts have functionally seized up in the time of COVID and even now are not anywhere near normal levels of functioning. And they have established a triage list under which judicial review is incredibly low. And so as a result, we're not actually seeing judicial review of executive action in the courts in Canada. And I think the lack of resilience there is really remarkable. And meanwhile, we have a tribunal here in British Columbia called the Civil Resolution Tribunal, which is operated entirely online in a data-driven, human-centered way, which has been the foundation of the reform taking place in the UK under Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service. And so we have a counterexample of a online, flexible, resilient, anti-fragile system, which our courts are demonstrably not meeting.
Well, and I would encourage anybody who is interested in these issues about how to build resilient judiciaries. Yes, you did. Ironically, you've frozen up your video screen. Maybe turn your video off for a moment and then come back in. There we go. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know where I.
Were you finished? I don't. We're talking about the. We were hearing you just fine. You were talking about the way the UK is modeling some of its efforts on what you're doing in British Columbia to have online tribunals in the civil matters there. And I was just highlighting and recommending to everybody who's attending your essay in the regulatory review series about COVID-19 because it's a really tremendous essay about the way that we should be thinking about innovating in our legal system more generally, and how maybe we're going to learn from this experience about how to redesign our interactions between citizens and their courts. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Christy, at this point?
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly when I cut out,
Okay.
but maybe Zoom was doing me a favor because I was on a tear about the failure of resilience in our courts. So
no, we heard all of that. It was just ironic that your video was frozen and while you were talking about resilience. But we did hear, I think, everything you were saying. We have just a few minutes remaining, but I would like to invite anybody to still add, questions that they want to ask to the Q&A. We'll turn to that in just a moment. Nason, I didn't turn to you. What would you like to say about the courts in Asia?
And I actually do have a couple of things to say specific to China. I should say that it turns out they're doing renovations in a unit in my apartment building. So if that sound comes up and it's just too bad, someone let me know and I'll keep my insights about this to myself and mute myself. But in the small time I have before they start drilling again, there are two main points that have to do with China. The first is that over the past 15 years or so, there have been a few very well publicized instances of government failures or private sector failures that implicated the government that generated a round of litigation that got attention, and eventually the government shut down. So the first had to do with the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. So there was a number of suits that were brought against the government because of the shoddy construction, which resulted in excess deaths in Sichuan province. Then in 2009, there was a bunch of lawsuits having to do with the melamine milk scandal. In both cases, the lawsuits were brought, they got to a certain point in the court system, and then when the gravity of the claims were made apparent, that's when the Chinese government shut those cases down. In 2018, there was a scandal having to do with vaccine manufacturers in China. And in response to that, the National People's Congress passed a new law that basically makes it easier to bring lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers in China for punitive damages. And so what I'm keeping an eye on is in China, they have already started basically distributing a vaccine with not the full slate of controls that probably might make it a more safe enterprise. And so I am quite confident that there will be a constituency to bring lawsuits against those vaccine manufacturers in the future based on the new law that was passed in 2018. But of course, this is so sensitive at this point, and the idea of a vaccine for COVID is such a priority for the central government. I would not put a lot of confidence in those lawsuits being extremely successful. But it's just maybe even ironic that right before you have this very important instance of a vaccine being issued in China before, it's fully vetted, right against the background of that, there's this new law that makes it possible to bring lawsuits for punitive damages against vaccine manufacturers. The second point that I want to say, which is a different kind of point, but I think is important in this context, has to do with whether American courts can hold the Chinese government accountable for its failings with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, the Missouri Attorney General has brought a very well-publicized lawsuit which tries in a couple of different ways to skirt the restrictions of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act to basically hold Chinese authorities accountable. And the way that that lawsuit has been structured that tries to get around the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act is, one, they try to name the Chinese Communist Party as a defendant as opposed to the Chinese government. And secondly, to specify the role of the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a private commercial actor. Now, I'm not an expert on foreign sovereign immunities, but people that I know who are, including my colleague at Penn, Jacques Delisle, Shemin Keitner at Hastings, have written pretty persuasively, in my view, that those are not fantastic arguments on behalf of the Missouri Attorney General's suit or all the similar suits that are being brought in the US in this respect. And that suit, for now, has stalled in the district court, in part because the Chinese government has not responded to it. But that, I don't think, is the end of the story, because we do know that there are some discrete instances in which Congress has authorized through legislation lawsuits against various countries that would not have been permissible because of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And because of the nature of the US-China tension in general right now, because of the way in which the Chinese government has been, very strongly criticized in American political discourse. Even today, we saw that Kelly Loeffler, senator from Georgia, tweeted out that the Chinese government has to be held accountable for President Trump and Melania Trump contracting the virus. I do not think anyone could say it's beyond the political plausibility that Congress would, in fact, enable legislation like that. And you could actually see American courts deal with the accountability of the Chinese government in this respect. Whether or not that would get you anything tangible down the line, I don't know, but there will be a role like that, I think, more likely than not.
Right now, what we do see in the US Congress is a push by Senate Majority Leader McConnell and other Republicans to try to insert in legislation and in a next relief package, liability protection or immunities for businesses and to some extent, I suppose, for schools as well. And to think about the liability businesses, it raises a question that James has entered in the Q&A function. So I'd like to ask if anybody would like to comment on. He's wondering what kind of legal protections, regulations other countries have put in place to protect workers. Here in the US, OSHA has not really been too forthcoming, I guess, with national guidance. Maybe this is another example, Richard,
putting it mildly,
of what you were talking about earlier. But are there protections in other countries that maybe could be something a new administration might look to, for example, next year, putting in place for worker protection? Anybody care to comment on that? We have any occupational workplace specialists?
Well, I can't comment on other countries, but it is a huge, huge issue in the United States. The states are desperate for guidance. And if I've actually been reading through a lot of the various US state documents that they have issued to employers within their own borders. And it's kind of a mishmash of voluntary and mandatory language, of vague and specific language. The employers are just bewildered most of the time and don't know what to do with these things. And the level of enforcement is also questionable and highly variable. So there really, really needs to be, if there is a new administration, that really will have to be a priority, unless people think that we're somehow at the end of this pandemic and can just wait it out for a vaccine. But if you appreciate that we're going to be living with this virus for a year and a half longer, we really, really need guidance. I mean, mandatory. We need rules for how what employers can do to ensure the safety of their workers. And of course, those rules require that the equipment necessary to keep people safe be available as well. So there's an interplay between those two things.
Well, let me ask this as a last question here. William raises a scenario in which, the head of a government has conflict with public health institutions, scientists, the experts. I don't know if others want to comment from elsewhere around the world about any tensions between presidents or prime ministers who have sort of gone to battle with some of their scientific public health administrative bodies. Certainly we could talk about that here in the US, but Bruno, Brazil comes to mind. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, well, I think I was thinking of this, another point of comparison between Brazil and the US, which is the defense by the head of government of this medicine, which apparently, according to most of the scientific work being done so far, doesn't work. There's no major contribution for the symptoms of COVID, which is hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. And I've been following a bit what goes on in Brazil, because pretty much like Trump, there is this position by Bolsonaro. And luckily, the regulatory agency has at least been able to go around most of the wishes of the president, and at the same time that they became much faster in the way. I mean, it could be potentially an example of an unruly kind of practice, which is basically trying to decrease the stringent of some of the tests, or some of the pre-existing rules that had to be applied for vaccines and for medicines. In other cases, they were able to skillfully escape from the demand, including from the president, to go faster with chloroquine and other not completely vetted medicines and drugs that come up here and there without support by science. So there's this interplay between agencies and science at the end of the day, and presidents that don't seem to take much. I mean, are not much fond of them. Is certainly a good point.
And that may end up being the most challenging and perhaps even the most lasting effect on administration, public administration in the U.S. Is the delegitimization of the expertise at the FDA or the CDC, and especially when we get to a point where there is a vaccine that's ready for distribution. I mean, right now we know here in the U.S., based upon at least public opinion surveys, that a vast majority of the public is not interested in getting that vaccine right away. And so the progressive era separation between politics and expertise is playing out or in the reverse here in the United States, and there are real questions certainly here about how that will affect the ability to get the population vaccinated. We are at the end of our appointed time. I want to echo everyone who thanked the ABA section, Chris Walker and Kiefer, for helping us put this together. I want to personally thank Nason for his instrumental work, not only in putting together this panel, but actually being the brainchild of the entire 40-part series that the regulatory review ran and into which all of the panel members contributed. And I highly recommend all of their essays to you. If you haven't already seen it, go to the Regulatory Review's website. That's the Reg Review, all one word, theregreview.org. And you can follow all the panel members' essays there and many, many more essays. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time here together. I really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot. And I imagine we will have more of these conversations. And I hope it's a priority for any legal scholar to try to learn from this pandemic, try to glean lessons that can be learned from a comparative study of administrative responses. We have started this conversation here, and I hope it will continue. Again, thank you to the panel members, and thank you to everybody who joined us today as well.